There is a road map sold to tourists in Australia that highlights one town in pink. The instruction printed next to it says, "Do not stop," not "drive carefully," not "be aware." Do not stop. That is not graffiti scrawled by a local with a grudge. That is a product someone designed, printed, and sells in shops. But here is what that map does not tell you. That town is not even the most dangerous one on this list. One town on this list records a violent crime rate 687% above the national average, and another has a life expectancy lower than any country on earth. Australia markets itself as beaches, barbecues, and laid-back country towns. And for most of the coastline, that is real enough. But official crime data tells a different story once you leave the cities. Violent crime in regional Australia runs 40% higher per capita than in the capitals. The towns on this list do not just have elevated crime. Some record one offence for every 2 residents per year. This is not a top 10 ranking. It is a driving guide for roads you cannot avoid, where locals literally tell travellers to fuel up and get out before dark. Where the pattern starts. Walgett, New South Wales. Population 1,824. In recent reporting periods, the town recorded 846 criminal incidents, roughly 1 crime for every 2 people living there. But the raw count is not even the worst part. A legal analysis named Walgett the most dangerous area in New South Wales after dark, with a nighttime incident rate of 3,027 per 100,000 and more than half of all crimes occurring between 6 in the evening and 6 in the morning. When the sun goes down in Walgett, the data turns vicious. What makes Walgett more than just a statistic is how completely the town has hollowed out. The jobs left first, agriculture mechanised, services consolidated into larger centres, and the young people followed the work south. Shops closed, main streets emptied. What remained was a community with shrinking tax revenue, deteriorating infrastructure, and a growing population of people who could not afford to leave. The people who stay are not staying by choice. They are staying because selling a house in Walgett means finding a buyer in Walgett, and there are not any. Poverty concentrates. Desperation compounds. And the crime numbers reflect not a sudden crisis, but a slow bleed that has been running for decades. Walgett matters because it introduces the pattern you will see repeating in every town on this list. Job losses lead to population decline. Population decline crushes housing demand. Crushed housing demand drives away investment. And the absence of investment accelerates the collapse further. It is a death spiral, and once it starts, it almost never reverses. These are not random danger spots, they follow a structural logic, and Walgett is where that logic shows up clearest in the data. If you like deep dives into patterns like these, economic collapse, real estate traps, the places tourism boards do not want you to see, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next one. Because Walgett at least sits on roads with alternatives. The next town does not give you a choice. The highway that funnels you through danger. Tennant Creek sits on the Stuart Highway in the Northern Territory, a town of roughly 3,000 people with an assault rate of 12,641 per 100,000. That is several times higher than the already extreme Territory average. But here is the detail that separates Tennant Creek from every other town on this list. The Barclay Homestead Roadhouse is the only fuel stop for roughly 460 to 500 kilometres in either direction. If you are driving the Stuart Highway, you do not choose to stop in Tennant Creek. The road chooses for you. And what is waiting when you pull in is a town where 83% of assaults are domestic violence related and 56% involve alcohol. In 2017, Tennant Creek recorded a homicide rate of 59.6 per 100,000, nearly double the overall United States rate, in a town smaller than most American high schools. The employment base depends almost entirely on mining. When mining slows, there is simply nothing else. The fly-in, fly-out workforce creates a kind of social fragmentation where earnings get spent elsewhere and the community bears the consequences alone. The tension at Tennant Creek is between necessity and safety. You must stop, but locals say, do not stop. But Tennant Creek isn't even the worst Stuart Highway town on this list. Drive north and you hit Katherine, a service town of 10,000 where 1,062 assaults were recorded in a single year, a 30.6% increase. Assault rates approach 9,700 per 100,000, with 72% linked to domestic violence and 62% to alcohol. Katherine is bigger than Tennant Creek, which makes those per capita numbers even more alarming. A town with a hospital, schools, and proper infrastructure still can't outrun the pattern. The entire Stuart Highway corridor from Alice Springs through Tennant Creek to Katherine is a continuous high-risk transit route with no safe alternative. It's not a road with a bad stretch, it's a gauntlet that runs for over 1,000 kilometres.
The tourist town the world noticed. If Katherine surprised you, the next town will stun you, because this one you have actually heard of. Alice Springs appeared on a 2024 Global Most Dangerous Cities Index alongside Tijuana and Cape Town. It was the first Australian city ever to make the top 20. The tourism body itself publicly used the word crisis. But the ranking is not the real story. The real story is the collapse of the economy that was supposed to protect it. Home break-ins climbed 35.6%. Commercial break-ins surged 63%. Motor vehicle theft jumped 42.3%. Crime rates run roughly 10 times Sydney's on a per capita basis. When alcohol restrictions expired in July 2022, the town essentially detonated. Assaults and property damage surged so dramatically that the government reimposed strict bans, including curfews for anyone under 18. Those restrictions reduced alcohol consumption by only 26%. Nearly 3/4 of residents still found ways to drink despite the regulations. The rules treat the symptom, while the underlying drivers, intergenerational trauma, poverty, and overcrowding, remain completely unaddressed. Alice Springs flips the assumption most people carry about dangerous Australian towns. This is not some forgotten outpost nobody cares about. This is a place the world knows, that tourism dollars flow into, that appears on bucket lists and travel brochures as the gateway to Uluru. And it is falling apart in real time. If this can happen to a town with international name recognition, what is happening in the places nobody is watching?
The Kimberley is burning. What's happening in Alice Springs is not isolated. The entire Kimberley region of Western Australia is burning with the same fire. Halls Creek, a town so small it barely registers on most maps, saw a mass brawl involving 30 to 40 people armed with sticks, knives, and metal bars, forcing police to be flown in from outside the region. A local hotel considered installing an electric fence around its property. Police used a front-end loader to physically crush seized alcohol by the pallet. Family violence offences hit an all-time high of 589, a 75% rise in a community that was already in crisis. Now drive 350 kilometres north to Kununurra, the marketed tourist gateway to the Kimberley. It is worse. Kununurra recorded 124,600 incidents per 100,000 residents. Assaults climbed 49% year on year. Alcohol-related crime runs at 30 times the state average. A coronial inquest heard testimony that children were trading sex for alcohol. These are not statistics designed to shock. They are findings from official investigations into how an entire region came apart. And here is what makes the Kimberley story particularly grim. Businesses in these towns actively lobbied against alcohol restrictions to protect tourist spending, even as the data screamed crisis. Tour operators wanted visitors flowing through, publicans wanted bars open. Behind the brochure photos of gorges and waterfalls, communities were disintegrating. The collision between the tourism brand and the lived reality is not a side effect, it is the core tension. Two versions of the same place exist simultaneously, and only one of them makes it into the marketing. The towns that broke the scale. If the Kimberley's numbers shocked you, these next two towns exist on a completely different statistical plane. Laverton, Western Australia, has a 1 in 4 annual chance of being a victim of violent crime. Its violent crime rate is 687% above the national average. Over 99% of Australian suburbs are safer than Laverton. This town is not on the scale, it is off the edge of it.
But even Laverton does not hold the top position. Woorabinda, Queensland, a community of roughly 1,000 people, records 52,993 incidents per 100,000 residents. That is not a crime rate, that is a crime saturation. More than 98% of Australian suburbs record fewer violent incidents. In a community this small, that number means nearly everyone is either a victim, a perpetrator, or both, often within the same household, often repeatedly. And the answer to how this happened is not a mystery. Woorabinda was created through forced relocations, where multiple Aboriginal language groups were moved onto a single reserve by government policy. Different communities with different customs, different languages, and different kinship systems were compressed into one settlement and told to coexist. The community was not built to thrive, it was built to contain. The crime is not random dysfunction, it is a direct consequence of policy decisions made decades ago that nobody reversed. Every statistic coming out of Woorabinda is a receipt for choices made by people who never had to live with the results.
The town where life expectancy belongs in the 1800s. Statistics eventually stop being numbers. In one town, they became a life expectancy that belongs in the 19th century. Wilcannia was once a prosperous Darling river port. Steamboats moved wool and supplies up and down the waterway. Businesses lined the main street, and the town had genuine economic purpose. But when the river trade died and the roads replaced the waterways, everything collapsed and nothing replaced it. Today, Indigenous male life expectancy in Wilcannia is 36.7 years. That's roughly half the national average. It's lower than every country currently tracked by the World Health Organization. Domestic violence runs at 13 times the rate of surrounding communities. Infant mortality is 3 times higher than the state figure. During COVID, 11% of the entire town was infected simultaneously, with no local ICU to handle the cases. Patients had to be airlifted out, assuming the flights could get there in time. The nearest serious medical facility is hours away by road, and for a community where health outcomes are already catastrophic, that distance is often the difference between treatment and tragedy. This is the town from the map. This is where the do not stop warning comes from. And that warning deserves a second look because it isn't cruelty, it's a symptom. A place where the median age of death for men sits in the mid-30s has problems that run so deep, a passing traveller can sense the danger without understanding any of the history behind it. The real warning isn't about tourists, it's about what happens when a community is abandoned for decades and the only thing outsiders ever learn about it is 2 words on a pink highlighted map: don't stop.
Every town so far has been a story of decline. Bourke breaks the pattern, and that is why it goes last. In 2013, Bourke topped New South Wales crime rankings in 6 of 8 major categories. The state government was spending $4 million a year just to incarcerate young people. The spiral was running at full speed, and by every metric, Bourke should have ended up on this list as another cautionary tale with no resolution. But a local elder named Alistair Ferguson looked at those numbers and saw something the government had not. The money being spent on prisons was not stopping crime. It was funding a revolving door. Kids went in, came out harder, and went back again. So Ferguson launched the Maranguka Justice Reinvestment Project, a program that redirected prison funding into youth programs, education, mentoring, and alternative sentencing. Instead of spending millions to lock kids up after the damage was done, the money went into preventing the damage from happening in the first place. The result was a 38% drop in top-tier juvenile charges and a 31% rise in Year 12 school retention. Fewer kids in cells, more kids in classrooms. It is not a fairy tale. Bourke still records serious crime above state averages, and the problems have not vanished overnight. But the data moved. And that single fact reframes every other town on this list. The problem was never that these places are inherently broken. The problem is that they were left behind. And when someone actually invests in a community instead of writing it off, the trajectory can change.
These 10 towns share a common trajectory: colonisation, forced relocation, economic extraction, withdrawal of investment, and decades of policy neglect. The marketed image of Australia is one country. The data reveals another. They exist side by side, separated not by geography, but by attention and resources. Sydney property sells for $2 million, while communities 6 hours away record life expectancies that would not pass for a developed nation. That gap is not closing, it is widening. The question is not whether these places will keep struggling, it is whether the pattern can be broken before the next town joins the list, or whether it already has. Right now, communities across regional Australia are sitting at various points on the same downward curve, watching the same indicators flash the same warnings, waiting for intervention that may never arrive. That map warning, "Do not stop," is not just advice for drivers. It is what Australia has been telling itself about these communities for decades. Do not look, do not engage, keep moving. Bourke showed what happens when someone finally stops. Which of these towns shocked you most? Let me know in the comments.